Hi, my name is Ananya Banerjee. Thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of the South Asian Allyship Network, I welcome you to our first event. Our goal is to start having conversations about anti-Black racism in our South Asian community. But before we get started, we want to acknowledge this land we speak on as settlers, which has been home to current and long-standing Indigenous communities as they are faced with injustices that have happened and are still happening right here in Canada. In fact, yesterday, another Indigenous man was fatally shot by RCMP. The reality is a lot of communities are impacted by racism. But when it comes to our Black communities, throughout history, they have faced and continue to face racism by white supremacy and us, yes, us, the South Asian communities. As an educator at the University of Toronto who teaches about anti-Black racism and mentors many Black students, I have witnessed over and over again their personal difficulties, identity crisis, feelings of isolation, avoidance from their non-Black peers, and encounters with racially hostile acts. With the recent deaths of George Floyd in the US and Regis Porchinsky-Paquet here in Canada, leading to global protests, we feel, like that many others, that we can no longer remain silent. The South Asian Allyship Network, made up of public health professionals, was formed with the support of our Black peers and colleagues who believe that ending our anti-Black racism starts at home, in our families, in our communities. All of us can recognize that there is a lot to learn about the past and present experiences of Black communities facing injustice. We all have a collective duty to educate ourselves and bring awareness within our South Asian communities. Therefore, we have created this platform to engage all of you and all of us together in these hard but necessary conversations. We invite you for the next hour and a half and to be part of a conversation that will definitely not be easy. And that's okay. We will be gentle and patient. Learning to be an anti-racist, an ally, or standing in solidarity does not come from simply attending a webinar, posting on social media, or watching the news. It is a lifelong commitment to deep listening, reading, awakening, questioning, reflecting, seeing, intervening, dismantling, reimagining, and rebuilding. We have three advocates and role models with us today: Seema Hari, Dr. Arun Mukherjee, and Dr. Alok Mukherjee, to spark a dialogue across generations and prompt us to care with compassion and be part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Each presenter will have 10 minutes to speak. Then we'll have a discussion on understanding anti-Blackness within our South Asian identities. At the end, all of you will have an opportunity to ask questions to Seema, Arun, and Alok. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this evening to highlight the Indo-Black history of protest and resistance. Dr. Arun Mukherjee has researched and taught Canadian, Indian, and South Asian literature for 30 years at York University, retiring in 2016 as someone who became a refugee following India's partition in 1947. Arun has an abiding investment in using literature to promote human rights and justice. She is an award-winning author who has published several books, notably The Gospel of Wealth and the American Novel, The Rhetoric of Dressier and His Contemporaries. Arun, the floor is yours. Thank you.
This evening, the topic of our allyship and the need to learn the past and the history before we can really emerge out of our, people talk about unconscious bias, but I think it is our uneducated state of mind. So I wanted to speak about the history that we never learn. And in my own case, as with many other witnesses and people who have spoken about their ignorance, our education had nothing to talk about some of the most important and tragic aspects of our global history. So I and many hundreds of thousands or millions of others, we never learned about the Atlantic slave trade that forcibly kidnapped people in the continent of Africa and brought them to slave in the tobacco, indigo, coffee, sugar plantations and cotton plantations in the so-called New World. We never learned that there were 11 million kidnapped African people who were brought to the New World to work against their will under terrible circumstances of human indignity, torture, cruelty, lack of rights, even to learn to read or write or get married or have a family. And that was not in our history books. We never learned that out of the 11 million that the historians now suggest that were put on the ships, only 9.6 million arrived in the New World. And so our learning was mostly about, the arrival of Columbus and, the city on a hill and Pilgrim's, Rock and so on. So that history of exploitation and degradation of millions of human beings was completely erased from our consciousness. So it took me almost half a life to begin to understand, to learn about this state of affairs, which when you first learn, you're completely shocked. And it was an African-American writer, Richard Wright, whose book first made me aware of what a terrible history it was. So his book, Black Boy, talked about the post-Civil War situation in the South, where he grew up as a very angry young child, child of sharecroppers. And sharecroppers, again, we don't know the history of what that was. That was during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation liberated all the slaves, that there'll be no longer slavery. And General Sherman, he promised that the liberated slaves will have 40 acres and a mule to call their own, because the mules, were now, they had in excess after the war was won. So this promise, 40 acres and a mule, was not kept. And so the sharecroppers were people, the land was returned to the plantation owners, and then they gave it at exorbitant rents to the African Americans post-Civil War. So Richard Wright, the son of a sharecropper, grew up angry. He deviously learned how to get books from the public library, because he was not allowed to as a Black person. So he would go to the library and pretend that his master had sent him to get the books. So these were these small acts of rebellion that the African American population carried out to survive these uh, very unjust laws that came into the American South after the end of Civil War and the constitutional amendments, which gave them all the rights to vote, to assemble, to own property, and so on, own their own person, and yet they never got to enjoy those laws. And so the movement from the American South, where the Ku Klux Klan was killing, lynching the African American people who became somewhat prosperous. The KKK would go after them. The Reign of Terror, the white hooded knights with their torches, and this famous heartrending song of Billie Holiday, "Strange Fruit," which sings the lament of 44,000 African American people who were lynched in this post-Civil War so-called Reconstruction era. So that is the history of oppression and the resistance that was carried out by the African American people against this dehumanization, the injustices, and 400 years this resistance in various forms lasted, which I, of course, cannot talk about in 10 minutes. But up to 1955, the beginning of the civil rights movement with the rebellion of Rosa Parks to give up her seat in the colored section of the bus to a white man because the white section of the bus had filled up. And leads to her arrest and then charges of promoting civil unrest, which then leads to the Montgomery bus boycott of a whole year and ignites the fire of the civil rights movement, which begins in the 1960s with famous actors like Dr. Martin Luther King, and finally leads to the Civil Rights Act passed by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So these are all great things that happened, but all the gaps between what is on the paper and what is the reality, the violence against the African American, African Canadian, and other members of the Black diaspora in the New World continues. If we think about Canada, and we celebrate about the Underground Railroad and the escaping slaves were coming to Canada, to the land of glory, but that isn't true, because the Black communities faced the same kind of unequal treatment, the segregation, the lack of opportunities. And now Viola Desmond, who is on our $10 bill, and her famous act of walking into a movie theater in her town in 1946 and refusing to sit in the area for so-called colored only, and embracing being arrested, and these very very courageous and very heroic acts that the Black diasporic members in the New World, I use that term because these acts have happened not just in the US, but on the Turtle Island, in the Caribbeans, and Haiti still remains an example of the price you pay if you fight, for your independence. The penalties that were forced on the first Black Republic of the New World, Haiti, by France in order to pay their owners, the slave owners, and it amounted to $500 billion in today's currency that France extracted from Haiti, and the debt wasn't paid up until the late 1960s. So what we see today in the ways of the police brutality in both US and Canada that Ananya, you referred to, is sort of a continuation of this 400 years of oppression and 400 years of resistance, and the impunity with which Black lives have been endangered. Now that we have these cell phones and many concerned citizens have endangered their own lives to make these video witnessing of the killings, and this eerie echoing in George Floyd's I can't breathe. The same sort of killing happened in New York not that long ago, and those were the last words of that victim of the police brutality as well. So our task of moving to freedom, to emancipation, to work towards that hasn't ended. And I hope that we South Asians can join the struggle for Black Lives Matter and other movements that are happening for human rights and justice in our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun, for giving us a brief overview of Black history and what is sometimes denied to this day, but what must be recognized: structural racism, oppression, and resistance. We have now Seema to provide an overview of current events on police brutality and anti-Blackness. Seema Hari is a software engineer at Snapchat and is joining us all the way from California. She is a prominent activist fighting colorism and anti-Black racism. Paving the way for dark-skinned Indians in the modeling industry, Seema advocates for breaking beauty-related stigma on an international scale. She is a strong human rights champion, digital content creator, and has been an outspoken ally to the Black community. Seema, please tell us what is currently happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all those kind words. I want to first step in and acknowledge that, like everyone else, I'm imperfect too. And like Ananya said in the beginning, this is a journey, and it's a lifelong commitment to dismantle racism in your own subconscious mind. So I'm not perfect, I'm not an expert, but I'm doing what I can. And that acknowledgement is very important, because unless we make that acknowledgement, we'll consciously try to be in denial of our own racist behaviors. And, this is going to be an evolving journey. So if you call yourself perfect and take the high ground, you will never be able to improve. So with that, I wanted to touch a little bit upon what is happening currently. So we're going through a worldwide movement in support of Black Lives Matter. And that has been spurred by recent events, the recent deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Nina Pop, and then most recently George Floyd, and then Regina in Toronto, Canada. As we speak, there are more and more lives being lost to not only just police brutality, but also anti-Blackness in North America and across the world. And the thing that we need to acknowledge is that, the first thing that we hit against when we talk about this is that people refuse to stand with Black Lives Matter. People think that, hey, they're from a different cultural background or a different race, so Black Lives Matter should not matter to them. And that's the first step in our journey, is to stop right there and say that, Black Lives Matter out loud and proud. The first thing that people say is that, I'm from a different race, I have my own problems, and, as a South Asian immigrant, I face racism myself. So I shouldn't worry about Black Lives Matter, and I should stay silent. And that is the first thing that I want to tell all of you, that, without the struggles of Black people, and without the protests, and without all of their efforts in dismantling racism and white supremacy in the United States, we wouldn't have been able to come here. So we owe it to them. The reason that we don't have to use colored bathrooms, the reason that we are not discriminated against openly in public spaces, is because they fought for us, and they protested, and they gave their lives for us to have basic human and civic rights in the United States and Canada. So we owe it to them, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where public discrimination against people of color was deemed illegal. So without that act, the 1965 Act, which was opened up immigration reform for all South Asians to come to America, would not have happened. So first the Civil Rights Act happened in 1964, and then there was mounting pressure to expand the civic rights given even beyond Black Americans to Asian immigrants, etc. And that's why we had the immigration reform in 1965, and that is the reason I can be in this country, and many other South Asians can be in this country. So we owe everything, all the rights that we have, to the Black community, and that's why it's very important for us to stand for them. So as soon as you hear someone denying that they don't stand for Black Lives Matter, the first thing I would suggest is like educating them and educating yourself if you're feeling that Black Lives Matter and all lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, just because it's so central to the struggle. Even if you're talking about your own careers, and if you're talking about culture, Black culture has permeated across media, and if you're in music or any kind of media, their struggles have paved the way for us to even being able to exist in those spaces. So we owe it to them with all that we have to fight for their lives. And we didn't just get here in a day. There have been, countless murders. Starting, I remember when I came here in 2012, Trayvon Martin had just been murdered by George Zimmerman, and George Zimmerman had actually walked free. He was not even a police; he was a part of the neighborhood watch. And this is one thing that, again, I wanted to stress on, is that racism is the prejudice against a specific race, but racism is like a catch-all term that dilutes the experiences that Black people have every single day. So part of my unlearning is to also think about this in terms of anti-Blackness and not just racism, because when you talk about racism, it's discrimination faced by different races, right? So what happens when you talk to South Asians sometimes is that they will say that, they face racism themselves. That's why, they don't care about Black Lives Matter. But what we are seeing right now in history, is that, the disproportionate amount of systemic oppression and brutality that Black people have to face, which, supersedes, which, is way ahead of the problems that we have to face. Not to say that we don't have to face racism, we do. But the struggles faced by the Black community are much higher and much more grave than what we have to face. Black people are incarcerated at the rate of something like 40% in the United States, where like the actual makeup in the United States population is only 13%. So they're disproportionately affected by laws, by policies that are racist against them in particular. And our struggles are nothing compared to the 400-year struggle of Black people to come out of slavery and get even just civil rights. So a lot of times when people say that, hey, this is not my problem, that's what I like to bring up. And I like to focus on anti-Blackness. So it's also really helpful to talk about anti-Blackness because, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the South Asian community itself, and it perpetuates itself in many different ways. So the first step is that, step back and acknowledge that there is a problem. As Hassan Minhaj pointed out in his Netflix clip most recently, that we have been active bystanders. And by being active bystanders, by default, we are racist. So we've been active bystanders when we watch all these incidents happen and stay silent. And in the case of George Floyd's murder, two of the police officers were actually, not white supremacists, not white people. So they stood by and watched this happen and did not intervene. And we see that across our community everywhere. There are a lot of people who are still silent even after, weeks of action. So the first thing is to acknowledge that we have, we have a role to play in this, and there is a lot of anti-Blackness in our own communities. So unless we acknowledge that problem, we won't be able to tackle it. So how do we perpetuate anti-Blackness, right? In South Asian communities, this can manifest in, straight up anti-Black dating preferences. So we can see that, a lot of times South Asian parents will tell their kids, you can date anybody you like, but don't date a Black person. That is a racist action. So you need to have a conversation about, hey, this is actually perpetuating anti-Blackness in our communities. This is the wrong belief to have. So that is one way how anti-Blackness perpetuates in South Asian communities. Another thing is colorism. Now, colorism is the discrimination faced by people of dark skin across the world. And this might seem really innocuous and just like a beauty preference, but this prejudice that we have then extends to all Black people as well, where we, only prefer Black culture when it's, or only prefer Black music when it's performed by a person who is light-skinned, but Black. Or, even in the anti-Black dating preferences, parents will be okay with someone who's like slightly lighter in skin tone. But what I wanted to address is that, like, your colorism might seem like an innocuous beauty preference, but it manifests itself in many different ways. People will, the slightly racist action of, clutching your purse when you see someone dark skin pass by. And, it's really hard to tell people's race by just their skin and just their appearance, especially in this world where we live, where it's been globalized for so many years. So colorism might feel like a innocuous thing, but you have to stop yourself right there and examine yourself in about like, where is this preference coming from, and how will this manifest in other aspects of my life. And there are, of course, the other thing is that people always wish to just, ignore the issues of police brutality against Black people by saying that, this is not our race. Our race, like Asian Americans, are not like this. We are more model citizens of the country. And that's another thing to acknowledge, is that we have been fooled by the model minority myth, and we have to actively reject it in order to start fighting anti-Blackness and to show up in the Black Lives Matter movement. Because the model minority myth is actually a fully manufactured myth that, Asian Americans are model citizens of a country because they are highly educated and successful, and they're not part of like the crime scene. They don't get incarcerated that much. But that is actually a myth, because Asian Americans were only were allowed in this country after the immigration reform, and the immigration reform disproportionately only allowed Asian immigrants who were either super skilled or held really high degrees or had a very big special profession that was missing in the United States. So by default, the selection of Asian immigrants that came to this country were all either highly educated or already successful in some regard. So this model minority myth is used as a wedge to divide us, to separate us, and make us not stand with the Black people, and like make us believe that we are model minorities. But what we need to remember is that this is just a hierarchy created for us to not acknowledge Black people's struggles, which is the white supremacist notion, while also make divide us between Asian Americans and Black Americans, when white supremacy just still reigns. Like on the top is still white people, and all the beliefs and policies that flow down from there still hold white people at the top. So if we want to dismantle anti-Blackness, we need to reject that model minority myth that we are somehow better than them. And that is one thing that we need to actively start dismantling. So there's a lot of ways, like I said, that anti-Blackness perpetuates. So the first step is acknowledging that. The next step is self-education, like understanding that you are, like Arun said, that we are not given the education that we need about our histories, about slave trade, about systemic oppression, and about how policies that are racist, that have racist outcomes, have been been passed by the Senate time and again, that lead to racist outcomes of Black people being incarcerated at a very high rate compared to other races. So educating yourself is the next step, and coming to this webinar is a step. But like Ananya said, and like I repeated, this is a lifelong commitment. You will never be fully educated. There's no master's degree in anti-racism. There's no master's degree in anti-Blackness. So the burden of education is on you, is on us. We can't ask Black people to educate us about their struggles. We have to do that ourselves. So the next step is taking this action, which I'm really thankful and grateful that all of you have already done, is like acknowledging the problem and then deciding that, okay, now I'm going to educate myself. There's a reason we are not being educated about this, which is also rooted in white supremacy. They don't want us to know our struggles. They don't want us to know the dark history behind the building of this country. So second step is self-education. The third step is internal work, is asking yourself reflective questions, like, what am I doing? What are my biases that I've subscribed to in this world that make me act in a racist way? And this might, like I said, it might seem like really small, innocuous things, like, you get scared when somebody enters the elevator, or like you clutch your purse. And these are just like things that you have to keep in your mind and let your subconscious, know that and acknowledge that there are behaviors that you yourself have that can perpetuate racism. And I think self-reflection and internal work is so important in this situation, because like I said, we are all imperfect, and there are so many things that we do by living in a racist society, because this society and all the policies and all the systems that are in place here, they're all stemming from white supremacy. By default, if we do nothing at all, we are all racist. We are all racist in our actions, and we are all racist in our thoughts. What we need to do is, start doing the internal work of stopping that first reaction that comes to your brain when you think of something that is racist, right? So unless you acknowledge them, and unless you write all this down and understand your own biases, you won't be able to stop the reaction that comes to your brain. So the first step is that once you acknowledge your biases, then you'll be able to act on them. So do the internal work. And the third step is, final step is community action. So, start having difficult conversations within your community. Start having, every time your parents say something slightly racist, stop them right there and make them understand that, they might think that this is just something that they're saying in a safe space, but they might hold these beliefs outside, and how that collectively as a species is affecting and creating an anti-Black society. So for community action, host webinars like this, talk to your parents and friends, stop, racist behaviors when you see them, and call people in. If you don't correct their behavior, they're going to go and do this out in the world and they'll be judged for it. So instead of that, we call them in and, like, as an ally and as a friend, like, compassionately explain to them that, hey, actually this behavior and this note that you remarked that you made is slightly racist, and let me help you in educating you in why this is problematic and why this will lead to worse outcomes in the future. And that's it. So start with, to repeat all the steps in dismantling activism, start with acknowledgement that there is a problem, do the self-education work, do your internal work in understanding your own biases, and then go ahead and do community action and call people in and make them understand how we perpetuate anti-Blackness.
Thank you so much, Seema. You have reminded us all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. The civil rights movement has opened the door to all of us here as South Asian immigrants, first and second generation. And we need to be speaking out for Black lives and uproot anti-Black racism. Next, we have Dr. Alok Mukherjee to discuss police brutality and defunding the police in the Canadian context. Dr. Alok Mukherjee has served as acting chief commissioner and vice chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and was the chair of the Toronto Police Services Board from 2005 to 2015. He is the author of The Excessive Force, Toronto's Fight to Reform City Policing, and is a regular contributor to the Canadian media on issues of policing, justice, human rights, and equity. He is also a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University in downtown Toronto. Alok, thank you, and we look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ananya, for that kind introduction and for asking me to talk about a rather critical subject, that of police brutality and the fight for defunding the police in the Canadian context. Well, this is a rather critical juncture in the history of the struggle by members of Canada's Black community to ensure that we have a policing system that actually serves and protects and doesn't kill and oppress. We have all been following the recent events, and we know that as we speak, there are incidents or instances of police brutality being reported from all parts of Canada. And right now, just yesterday, we heard about the police officer in Peel region who killed a young man, Dandria Campbell, and is refusing to either surrender his notes or to be interviewed by the SIU, which is the arm's length investigator into serious incidents. This is just one example of the kind of police conduct that the Black Lives Matter movement is challenging and addressing. Just yesterday and day before, we heard from the commissioner and deputy commissioner of RCMP denying that there is any such thing as systemic racism in the RCMP. That does not jive with the experience of members of the Black community, as well as members of the Indigenous community in Canada. So what is the context of this pattern of police behavior that people are now pushing back against? To put it very simply, nature, policing embodies force. The police officer, by their uniform, by the belt of weaponry that they wear, by their very presence, represent force. That force is backed up by the legal authority, the legal permission that has been given by governments for them to shoot and kill or to use other forms of force. And the fact is that the police use force in very different ways when it comes to interacting with members of different communities. And we know from the history of policing just in this one city, Toronto, that there has been a regular drumroll of police killings of Black people in this city. In fact, the Independent Investigative Unit, SIU, was directly the result of agitation and demand and pressure, primarily by the city's Black community, for holding the police accountable for the use of force. Now, as I said, police, by their very presence, represent force, but that force is used in different ways and in different with different intensity against different people. There are many people in the city who will never experience police use of force, and there are members of the Black community who experience excessive use of force. That's the problem. Behind that is the police culture. It's a culture that divides society between those they protect and those they protect from. This other is constructed by how they look, how they dress, how they speak, how they move their body, their socioeconomic class, and so on. I once wrote that policing involves suspicion. And based on these types of visible characteristics, police officers decide who is to be suspected, who is to be stopped, who is to be questioned, who is to be not believed. And we know from years of data gathering by the media that the largest single target of police suspicion are members of the Black community. Those interactions resulting from this culture of suspicion have had serious consequences in terms of frequent use of excessive force. We should not ignore the fact that actually force is being used all the time. We only hear about those uses of force that result in death or serious injury. But it's safe to assume that police use force all the time. Hence the title of my book, Excessive Force, that force is being all the time, and then there are those particularly Black people who are the targets or recipients of excessive use of force. There have been struggles dating back to many years to hold police accountable. And the governments, as a result of pressure, have created supposed independent arm's length structures of accountability, such as the Special Investigations Unit. But what we know is that they produce very little result. The reason that police brutality continues is that there has been insufficient or ineffective accountability. The vast majority of cases that are investigated by the SIU, no action is taken. The police officers involved are found to have acted legally, lawfully, and for good reason. Public confidence in the Black community has reached such a low level that is giving rise to the demand for defunding police. There is a strong sentiment, strong feeling based upon years of experience that it's not going to be enough to try to reform police, because this is a system, this is a structure that needs more than reform. So the demand for defunding means we need to rethink, reimagine ways for keeping our community safe and truly pay attention to its wellness. That demand for defunding means that we spend less on thousands of highly paid, uniformed, armed police officers, and we take that money and invest that money in those other supports that truly contribute to the making of a safe and well and healthy community, such as investment in children's education, investments in health, investments in housing, investments in social services, mental health, anti-Black racism initiatives. So the demand for defunding says, don't spend $1.2 billion on policing, whose job is the exercise of force and whose job has been the use of excessive force against Black community members and other young people, poor people, indigenous people. Take that money and invest it in areas which will have a preventive impact, so that the occasion, the instances, the reasons why members of the public have contact with policing are significantly decreased. So there's a history of police use of excessive force. There's a history of fighting back against it. Today, the Black Lives Matter movement protest has raised that history to yet another level. And with its dramatic call for defunding, it has forced politicians, lawmakers, governments to seriously rethink what policing does and what other kinds of more useful, beneficial systems are needed to contribute to the making of an equitable community that is safe, that is well, and that treats all members with dignity and respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alok. You have given us the idea of associating Blackness with criminality and characterizing Black communities as dangerous is indeed perpetuated by bodies like the police. The Black community generally does not trust the police to uphold their rights, and as a result, we should not also trust the police and stand by our Black communities. In the next 15 minutes, we are going to be showcasing a conversation that will take between two generations. And we really hope this conversation that does take place between all three of our speakers will inspire all of you to have similar conversations at home with your parents, with your aunts, with your uncles, with your grandparents, and also with your younger kids. This has to be an intergenerational effort. And I welcome back all three of our speakers. And to begin the facilitated discussion, I want to come back to all three of you and perhaps start off with Arun. How do you recommend that these conversations that are so needed in our homes within the South Asian communities can happen with our parents or relatives who are often hesitant to speak out, especially when it comes to thinking about abolishing the police or protesting or with family members who do hold strong anti-Black stereotypes? Arun, would you like to lead the discussion?
It's a very difficult task to raise these very important issues, but where also they touch a raw nerve in the family, the things that Seema was talking about, this aversion to have your children date Black persons is something so deep rooted in our families. And Indian African writer M.G. Vasanji, if you read his fiction, he describes how in Africa, the Indian communities in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, how they created this plastic wrap around themselves and forced their children not to mingle with African people. So much so that in his novel In Between World of Vikram Lal, Vikram's mother, she forces this young Black man to say that he will only look at Vikram's sister as a sister, even though they are in love, and refuses permission to have them marry. So, this kind of visceral, dislike, or, this taboo against, befriending, hosting, inviting, Black members of our community is a terrible thing, among our South Asian community. And various pejorative words that they use in Hindi, Punjabi, and other Indian languages. So I think the young people have to confront their parents on that particular issue. And I mean, I can never forget, as a teacher, I had class, always had a very diverse class, and I got this distraught telephone call from the parents of an Indo-Caribbean young woman who had left home, and she had gone and married a young Black man who was her class fellow in my class. And the mother just kept saying, my God, what didn't I do for my daughter? And her father dropped her at college and picked her up, and here she goes and dishonors us. And you can talk to her and tell her how horrible Black people are, and so on and so forth. So this is a very difficult task. It's so ingrained that it won't be pleasant, but it has to be done.
Continuing the conversation. Yeah, Simran, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, another thing that I talk about is how the people that you can change effectively, like we're trying to change people's minds, right? And the people whose minds you can change are actually only the people in your circle of influence. And I think that family and friends are so much more likely to listen to your opinion because it comes from a personal experience, and it will land much more better than them just listening to highly radicalized and sensationalized media on the TV, or them being in rabbit holes of social media algorithms that feed them things that they just want to hear over and over again. So to break those patterns, I feel like you can only make somebody listen if you are close to them. And I always use this framework that I got from Shifting the Culture, the Instagram account that is run by some great people, and it's called compassionate accountability. And compassionate accountability is deciding that you care about someone enough to put in the emotional and intellectual labor of holding them accountable for their words or actions in a heart-centered and compassionate way. And if you think about that, if you know, for all the people that will fit that bill, it will be your family and your closest friends. So it's only with them that you'll be able to, you know, hold them accountable in a compassionate way without having the context diluted. It's not going to be someone who's randomly commenting on your Instagram. It's not going to, you're not going to change the mind of someone who's, you know, some random fake account that's, you know, commenting on your post on Facebook. So, you know, really ask yourself whose minds you can change, and then realize that, you know, your family and and your friends who are holding these beliefs, they're most likely to listen to you than to anybody else. So I think that's why it's so important to have the conversation at home and with our friends and families first, before even, you know, trying to change the world and before trying to change people's minds online.
Alok?
Well, I think Arun and Seema have already said given quite a good list of suggestions. I'll only say a couple of things. One is, I think it is very important for us to make the effort to get accurate information and make ourselves well informed. There is a lot of good material, good analysis out there. I think it is important for young people to get themselves well informed. Seek out, if you're in the university or college, seek out courses that can, whether they are part of your formal specialization or not, but that give you information, analysis, access to resources, so that you can, when you engage with conversations in your family around the dining table or whatever, or have arguments, or you hear a stereotypical prejudiced remark made by an elder, you can use information analysis that is accurate. Second, I think we are at a moment in time when protest action has become very important, very critical, and we cannot remain aloof from it as if it is somebody else's struggle. And young people have the best opportunity. This is the best time of life to become active. By becoming active, I do not mean you have to be the leader, you have to be leading, you have to be organizing, but participate.
Mm-hmm.
Participate. Go and interact, stand side by side, shoulder by shoulder. Uh, that adds to your confidence, your knowledge, your comfort level in challenging colorism, shadism, prejudiced ideas within our own community.
Yeah. I would also like, there was someone who asked a follow-up question, that, you know, people, their parents and people who hold these beliefs, they're more likely to listen to local and cultural news versus their own kids. And I know this too. But the best thing that I have seen is acknowledging their opinions and then leading with questions. But why do you think that is? Like, why do you think dark skin is bad? Why do you think Black people should not have the right to protest? And why do you, so leading with questions and asking them to clarify their opinion actually leads them down a path where they have to explain themselves, and then they might actually land on you know, something that they had not found in their mind before. So I found it really helpful to lead with questions and continuously acknowledging what they're saying. Like, I hear you, and this is a belief held by a lot of people that is, you know, reiterated in this news, but can you tell me, like, one step deeper, Why could that be? Like, why do you think that Asian Americans are not incarcerated at the same rate of Black people? Because we had the Immigration Reform Act, and that Reform Act was, selectively only allowing immigrants who of Asian American heritage who were already kind of successful. So leading with questions and then backing it up with information, like Alok said, is, I think, the most effective way of having these conversations. And also, like, having them at a place where people can't get mad. So dinner table is a great time when there are other members of the family around you who kind of can keep the decorum of the conversation, and also offer differing perspectives, right? Like, sometimes I'm arguing with my dad about something, and my mom can come in and like intervene and take my side, or play arbiter. So those are the two things that I would say that help in having these conversations.
We have a few questions. Wanted to follow up. Is there any examples of South Asian people, who stood strongly in solidarity with Black communities that we can learn from? Obviously, three of you are here, but who are some other prominent people that in history that we can really see how we can be better allies with South Asian, with Black communities?
So I can name a few. Obviously, my knowledge on this is also limited, but Dr. Ambedkar, who fought for caste rights and prominent figure in the freedom struggle back in India, wrote to the Black civil rights movement's leaders here, showing his solidarity. So he has always stood with this struggle. There's also a history of the Dalit Panther movement, who stood with the Black Panther movement. And also in more recent times, we have people like, this Instagram account called Equality Labs that is run partly by Tenmohi Soundarajan, who's, a prominent Dalit activist who has always spoken about anti-Blackness in Bollywood, anti-Blackness in, South Asian pop culture and South Asian, cultural appropriation of Black culture. So I think those are the three examples that come to my mind.
Those are good examples. Well, if I may add, these are not prominent names, but in Toronto, for example, the early days of anti-Black racism movement led by people like Dr. Wilson Head, who is now passed away. He was a professor at York University and founder of Urban Alliance on Race Relations. Bromley Armstrong, who used to be a train conductor and became a very strong human rights activist. Their starting point was the experiences of discrimination and oppression in the Black community. They made sure that they brought along with them other people from communities such as South Asian community, and educated them to work as allies to support the struggle that they were leading. So we have in Toronto a history of building movements that draws in people like Adi Dharmalingam and others from our community as strong allies for their struggles. So there is a history. Unfortunately, there has been a decline in that kind of active, respectful participation.
My next question I thought we can have a discussion on is, often when we're having these conversations, within our communities, a lot of people say, well, we have our own systems of repression within the South Asian community where we deal with classism, we have casteism, colorism, and often, our problems overshadow what's going for us to realize the importance of what's going on in the Black communities. I was wondering if you could touch on, like, how do we leverage, on our systems of oppression, understanding they do not parallel fully with the Black communities, but that can enhance us to be allies?
I can speak about the casteism part. I come from a lower caste in India. We're qualified as a Shudra, which is the other backward class. But I think caste as a system was established way before we even had an understanding of race. So caste system is, I think, older and more deeply entrenched in the South Asian minds. And then, there's like a direct correlation between casteism and colorism, because the lower castes were the people who were working as laborers for the upper castes, or working in their favor. So most of the lower caste people are people who have been out in the sun for millennia. So they've been laborers and working class people since thousands of years. And there is then the retroactive association of like, okay, because these people are out in the sun, they're obviously oppressed because of that. But because all of these people then have darker skin tones in their genes, and because of having centuries of ancestors who were laborers, there's a general association of dark skin with low caste, and also upper caste with light skin. And there's like this whole upper caste purity angle, which they say like, oh, this woman is pure because she is light skinned, and there's like association with that as well. And through the system of arranged marriages, and through the system of upholding caste hegemony, through these practices of arranged marriage and no intermixing and things like that, the upper castes have traditionally tried to uphold their light skin superiority, and that has perpetuated colorism. And then it was exacerbated by Eurocentric companies coming in and like throwing their Eurocentric beauty standards on the Indian community and capitalizing on that and making that exponentially worse. So earlier it was like subtle in people's minds, they wouldn't talk about it, but then with the advent of fairness creams and skin lightening and Eurocentric beauty standards, now the conversation was mainstream, right? So there's definitely a link between casteism and colorism, and that colorism then feeds into anti-Blackness, because the people who haven't even been ever in like people in India, or like our parents who have just immigrated here, who did not have the history or did not understand racism as a construct until they actually came here, then apply those same casteist and colorist mindsets to race here, which then again furthers anti-Blackness. So even like they say racism is taught, but we have so many problems in our thing that are so interlinked that it may not even need to be taught. Like you may not need to tell a South Asian person to hate a Black person; they might just hate them just because of their skin color anyway. So I think that's the link. But curious to know your thoughts.
Well, if I may add to, the entrenched casteism, colorism, shadeism. South Asians, again, to reiterate what Seema said earlier, they have to do a lot of self-reflection. The ingrained self-hatred, perhaps, if you're a dark complexioned young woman from South Asia, then you have absorbed so much negativism, about, yourself. All of that has to be, brought out, self-love, new beauty standards. We have to work on several fronts, anti-casteism, racism, anti-Black racism, our sort of fractured relationship with Black communities in North America is one aspect of the homework that we need to do. Islamophobia in India is running rampant right now. Lynchings used to happen in the post-bellum United States. Now lynchings of Muslims are happening, at a horrifying, rate. So I don't, there's a lot to protest happening against Islamophobia, but there's also a lot of very active, in your face, Hindu nationalism that is perpetrating these crimes. So, I mean, South Asians really need a lot of unpacking on a variety of issues. And white supremacy, I mean, American President Trump, goes to India and is, greeted by 10 million Modi supporters. We need to really think about it, and in the diaspora, the South Asian diaspora, we need to bring out all of that and work on all these fronts. So we have a very difficult task ahead.
And I think to turn your question around, getting involved, participating in the anti-Black racism protest here could be a way for us to confront that baggage that we carry on our backs of casteism, colorism, regionalism, supremacist ideas. We have a very arrogant view of our culture. It's a constructed culture based on mythology rather than fact, right? But we have tended to absorb and imbibe all of that unquestioningly. And those of us who come from higher castes have had a sense of entitlement, which is quite parallel to white supremacy. So I think if participation, learning about, getting interested in, getting curious about what is going on in this movement led by Black Lives Matter, there might be an opportunity for us to then develop a more critical understanding of who we are.
Yep. And I've noticed this actually more recently with, Black Lives Matter happening at a time of the pandemic. Everybody around the world, everyone's eyes are open, and everyone has noticed this. And for the first time, we've all had like a collective visceral moment of understanding police brutality so closely and vividly. And that has actually, I've seen so many, people who support Modi and are aggressive Hindutva, Hindu supremacists post about Black Lives Matter and against police brutality, when at the same time I saw them, highly radicalized. And when police were beating up Muslims and asking them to sing the national anthem, recording that on video in India, they didn't really feel that visceral action because they were like, they're entrenched in that rabbit hole. So to pull them out of that without talking about crushing Modi or talking about, Modi being bad, pulling them out of that rabbit hole was really hard. But now when they see it outside of their culture in a completely different context, they're able to understand like the effect of police brutality, and I think it's opening up conversations everywhere. Like people are questioning, we've seen like the outpouring support across the world, and I think because we are having this moment of acknowledgement, I feel like we need to tap into that momentum and then turn people over and make them understand, this is a battle for human rights everywhere. This is about, police brutality everywhere. It's and that's not necessarily taking away from the Black Lives Matter movement. The thing is that, you have to stand for Black Lives Matter, and then that will help you understand the struggles across the world. And then, so like you said, show up for the Black Lives Matter movement, and show up for defunding the police, etc. And then that will slowly uncover your mind and peel off the layers that you need to understand, like how this is happening across the world.
Definitely. There's also been, a lot of questioning in terms of, abolishing the police, defunding the police, and it is quite complex. And a lot of us in our communities don't exactly understand what that means. And a lot of people hold this assumption that if we abolish the police, it'll create more chaos and more crime, and it's going to compromise our safety. How do we challenge this assumption, right? And I would love to hear from all of you.
If I may, almost 10 years ago, when I was the chair of the Police Services Board, and watching, on the one hand, the killings and maiming and injuring of young Black people, homeless people, and on the other hand, relentless rise in the cost of policing. Some of us started to talk about reimagining what constitutes community safety. And it is so heartening. And in my book, Excessive Force, there's a whole section that talks about how we need to move away from a police force, reduce reliance on this armed, uniformed authority figure to deliver programs that are not policing, that have nothing to do with crime, violent crime, like mental health, like ticketing or policing the homeless street person, like being in schools on a daily basis, which are all consequences of the political, economic policies that for the last 30 years or so, governments in USA, Canada, Western world have followed. They have reduced their investment in those programs and services which make for a healthy community, which contribute to preventing young people becoming hopeless. And instead, we've increased policing with dire, fatal consequences. So it is very heartening that today, right across North America, there's a questioning going on about the legitimacy of the status quo, of the existing model of armed killer police force. And defunding means reduce the police footprint, invest money in those things that make for a healthy society. And 10 years ago, when some of us said this, we were called anti-police. Today, it is a widespread demand. And it seems to me that we're at a juncture when it's going to lead change. So we have to acknowledge that defunding is a very important call for transformation.
And how is this even more important, right, for our Black communities, especially like with the Black Lives Matter movement? Seema, would you like to bring it more to the context of Black communities?
Yeah, so basically what has happened since the 1970s here is that there's been a mass incarceration of Black people, thanks to, in part, like laws and policies about petty crimes, where, police could just go and scoop up people from predominantly people of color neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods and just throw them in jail, and them not having access to, good attorneys, them not having access to a good justice system. And you'll see, like, if you start getting involved and if you really start looking at your city's budgets, and I highly recommend doing that, you'll realize the disproportionate amount of funding that goes to police departments. And I looked at it I looked at the budget in LA, and I was so shocked because there was $3 billion used to fund the LAPD, and negligible. Like, the other things don't even show up in the chart because the $3 billion is so big. You can't make a chart of like where the other money is going. So, and then, because of this movement, Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of LA, was forced to say, oh, we're doing a defund, and we're doing a, cut in police. And that was 150 million. That's like not even 5% of what the full budget was. But the fact is that people are finally hearing, like Minnesota has now made a, full-on defund the police initiative. So it is possible. And like the analogies that I saw on the internet that really helped me, and this is really pertinent to the case in Canada also. I think Regina, the woman who's murdered, also made a call to 911 for a mental health assistance, right? So that's the difference. Like, I feel like the police are being used as a catch-all for all problems, like any society's problem that exists. Okay, police will solve it. And they are neither educated nor trained to handle those situations. I myself have called the police in America only twice. Once when I got egged by rowdies in a car, and they were just egging just women on the street. And I saw them hit me, and then the next person they attacked was also a woman. So I just felt like, they should be like, if there's a police patrolling, they should probably look at what they're up to, because they don't seem like good people. Nothing happened. And the second time was when I saw an animal who required help, and I called all the animal shelters, and they were all closed, and they asked me to call the police. And I called the police. The police didn't come because they were told only to, they have an order of hierarchy of like the things that they need to solve, and they didn't show up. So I was stranded in the middle of the night with a hurt puppy. But the thing was, I should not have to call the police. And, when I'm having a mental health crisis, I should be able to call, a mental health services line that has experts who can talk to me and who can de-escalate the situation, and who are trained in handling these situations, instead of a police officer with a gun showing up at my house, which will make me feel even more unsafe and even more anxious. If you see a lot of like theft happening in a neighborhood, the answer again is not police. It's understanding like, why do people need to steal food and steal from smaller supermarkets? We need to intervene and solve the hunger problem, maybe. If someone is, if there's another emergency situation, every time we're relying on 911 as a catch-all, but it's not solving the issue, because like the police, like Alok said, shows up with force and escalates the situation immediately. So I feel like we need to invest in like really rethink what are the sources of all these crimes, and like, should they be really crimes? Can they be solved with something else? I think that's something Alexandra AOC said the other day in her live session really resonated with me. They were asked like, what does defund the police mean? And she said, defund the police, it's not hard to imagine. It just looks like a white suburb. Like, the reason white suburbs feel safe is because there are all these systems in place already for all the societal problems to be solved. There's good education, there's good healthcare, there's good mental health services, everyone has access to therapy, things like that. So if we make sure that we look at society's problems holistically, we will be able to solve it much more than just handing every problem to the police. I know I saw on like Last Week Tonight by John Oliver, which I highly recommend you watch the last episode, because it was, just game changing. He says that there's a town in America where the police are responsible for the dog problem of dogs and wild animals running away from their owners. And the police doesn't know how to do that. They're just being given all these roles that they can't fulfill. So I know defunding the police sounds really, final, and it sounds really aggressive, but it's not a switch that's going to happen overnight. It's just a call for us to look at society's problems holistically, and not thinking that every person who's committing who's a part of a problem needs to end up in jail, because jail is a whole different topic that we can go into. But that's my view on it.
Great, thank you. I feel like all of us can be here for hours and hear the three of you talk, and we have so many questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and I was just hoping that each of you can, provide us one tangible action or step for us to take in addressing anti-Blackness in our communities as South Asians. Arun, did you want to start?
Read a good book by a Black author. That's my one tangible action recommendation.
Thank you.
I would say also because I know there's a lot of petitions to sign and a lot of things to do. So do all of that, go to the protest, but also if you want to educate yourself, I think watching 13th on Netflix really helped me understand the criminal justice system here and how it disproportionately affects Black people. Highly recommend watching that.
Alok?
One thing.
Well, I said a book because I hope that it leads to all kinds of future actions.
Well, I was thinking one thing that we have to make every effort to do is to not ignore or sidestep the specificity of the movement. And I'm saying that because the other day I saw a letter by the CEO of a big company who is a South Asian woman and who wants to show her support for Black Lives Matter. But the letter talks about, and this is the letter to all their thousands of employees and customers and all that. But the letter talks about how we know this from experience and goes to tell the story of her father. And universalizes the understanding. But what happens in the process is that the specificity of the moment of the struggle is displaced. So there's a place for us to, and obviously we all use our own experience to relate, but we ought not to substitute this specific struggle with that experience. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I worry about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Seema, Arun, and Alok, for an absolutely stimulating evening. As I said, I can hang out with the two of you all day and have conversations as such. You have definitely enriched all of us. Your stories, your conversations were so helpful. The comments that we're getting is speaking volumes to the work that all three of you are doing. And you are definitely making us think deeper. And we will fight against anti-Black racism within our South Asian communities. This is the first step. We've all been struggling in the last couple of weeks, and your words have provided, I think, the much insight to have these conversations at our dinner tables, at our home, within our social networks. I'm grateful to our audience in attendance, and I really hope you can join us for the next webinar in our series. We'd also like to note that our webinar today obviously doesn't cover everything. It would be absolutely impossible to cover well over 400 years of anti-Black racism in one evening. Please be mindful that this is a webinar series, and topics we may have missed or skimmed over will be discussed in future webinars and on our social media accounts. Please follow us on Instagram at South Asian Allyship and Facebook. We would love to receive your feedback and suggestions for future topics, where to improve via email, or you can DM us on Instagram. I would like to acknowledge the team behind the scenes: Noshin Hussain, Ayman Nawaz, Amina Khan, Miriam Jamil, Harsh Nayak, Avantika Mathur Balendra, Niza Hafleen, and Natasha Kitalagoda. I would also like to thank the organization South Asians for Black Lives in the US for guiding our work. The South Asian Allyship Network started less than a week ago, and we are in firm solidarity with our Black communities in the ongoing global struggle against police brutality and anti-Black racism. Together, we will urge our South Asian communities and the Canadian government to take action against anti-Blackness. We must go beyond our solidarity statements and do the work that needs to be done in order to erase anti-Blackness in our own local context. We should ask ourselves what we are willing to put on the line and give up, including time, resources, and labor, in order for Black lives to truly matter and flourish. If you would like to act on some of the things we've spoken about, we have a Google Doc of resources and things you can get started, which is available in the video description. Our speakers have also provided a lot of great resources, a lot of great reads. Please support the call to defund the police in your city, and there is a link that will let you send an email to your city councilors. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, and thank you with much gratitude to our speakers tonight.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.